African Daily TV. And as you can see, our guest is comfortably seated in the studio and we are ready to take off. I want to salute all of you that are watching on the continent and in the diaspora. The topic for today, as we have seen, is the question of whether Africa actually were enslaved. Yeah, even though I put Africans were enslaved or colonized, but as a point of correction, we want to focus on the idea that Africans actually were never enslaved. So we get these, narratives out of our mind. So if you're joining the show for the first time, please make sure you click and subscribe. But if you're here, as usual, make sure you share the link and comment. We're ready to take questions today, but it's going to be a very, very, I don't know, a kind of a different session today, because for the past 400 years or 500 years, we've been talking about colonization and slavery and how we were hijacked from the continent. But for the first time, I don't know about you, and when I posted, I saw the comments actually were like, okay, this is new. We never thought about this. We never even heard something like this. So I'm sorry. Our expert, Seba, I call Seba, and you will understand the reason. He'll be telling us the reason why we refer to him as a Seba. Not that is his name, contrary to be named as an elder. These are two words that we have to also learn today that I just learned now, right? So our guest for today is Seba Hunter Alvin Adams III. Yeah. So as you can see, he's here in the studio and we're ready to start the conversation. So we thank you all for joining, and we wish that you're going to find this session another powerful tool for us to decolonize our minds, for us to change the narratives that have been actually, blacklisted on the African or the Black man everywhere. Everywhere you find yourself is the same story of poverty, corruption, wars, hunger, and dumb Africans that are crossing the oceans and dying in the sea. And so, it's really heartbreaking, but I'm happy that, we have an expert that would actually put that sense into our minds and make us, and give us a reason why we need to think and to own our own narratives as well as control them. Today, we've just been saddened by this breaking news, which actually was confirmed from the United Nations Human Rights Commission for Refugees, that at least 41 African migrants, including a child, died crossing crossing over to Europe, leaving, I think, from Tunisia or something like that. And these 41 are dead and missing in the oceans. And the question is, this is the kind of conversations that we want to hold today. Like, we thought slavery was when they came, they took us in boat, right? And sailors, they call it the Atlantic slave trade movement in those days. But today we find ourselves paying huge sums of monies, freely, crossing these dangerous routes to come to an illusion, to a place where we think it's a paradise, and thereby risking our lives and thereby killing ourselves and ending up dead, even no one to pay us the last respect. So the question is very sad, and we actually are sending out our condolences to all those that are involved and to the parents, particularly the families behind, that were just wishing to see that their loved ones will return back someday, bringing the big cake or the big cheese. That is nowhere to be found. So it is a sad day for Africa and the continent in general, as we heard this news today. So, but that's also one of the topic on which we would be talking about it today. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome to our guest back in the studio with you, sir. Good evening.
Hello, everyone. I'm here in the diaspora in Chicago, the home of our great mayor, late mayor, Mayor Harold Washington, and many other people. So thank you so very much, Dr. Tata, for inviting me to your program. And I hope that your viewers gain something from what we talk about.
Absolute. Yes, they have a lot because we've been announcing this topic, and we've been actually looking to have an expert to lecture us, to educate us on slave trade and Atlantic slave trade and the African mind and the oral history and the narratives. And thank you, you are here. So what is it that we are expecting to learn from you tonight?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is controlling our narrative and generating our narrative. There's a lot of forms of warfare, but two I want to emphasize today. One is, well, three really. There's moral warfare, and that's the warfare to terrorize and torture, quote, an enemy into submission. So they don't have the will to fight. They don't have the will to struggle. There is narrative warfare, and that's what we're seeing today. We see competing narratives. Which story is the story we should believe, for example? But then there's also something known as epistemological warfare. And that's the highest level of warfare, in my humble estimation, because that deals with the whole question of knowledge. Whose knowledge matters? Who produces the knowledge? And where does the knowledge go? Unfortunately, for the past 500 years, and there's been many people who've been talking about decolonizing the mind, and that's great. But we have to control, it's more than just decolonizing our minds. We have to control the narrative. We have to produce new knowledge. We're trapped in there's 5 stories that I want the viewers to get this. This is probably the most important thing. There's the story of stereotype. Mm-hmm. And Africans have been stereotyped as lazy, hypersexual, criminal, so forth and so on. There's a survival story, and that's the story that we have, that we survived this. We survived, quote, enslavement. We survived colonialism. We survived dictators and so forth. But then there's something known as strategic stories. And those are the stories that open up a possibility space for the future. And then there's sustainable stories. What is a sustainable story? For a long time, at least for hundreds of years, we've been told to devalue our oral history, that only written history counts. If it's not written down, well, then it doesn't count. But that's a fallacy, because for at least 300,000 years, we've been telling stories, right? Our brains love stories. And that's one of the things that we can talk about later. Is my background is in cultural neuroscience, the study of how culture influences our behavior, our brains, how our thoughts work, so forth and so on. But when we tell stories, it engages all of our brains, and we have 5 brains, not just the one in our head. We have actually 3 brains in our head. We have our heart brain, which is the source of our feelings, and we have our gut brain, that makes us want to do things for motivation, and we can talk about that later. And so storytelling, sustainable storytelling, engages all of our brains. But we have been framed to believe that only written stories matter. Mm-hmm. But say if someone is watching the World Cup, for example, right? Mm-hmm. They see the play on the field, right? They see the players moving around, but there's a commentator narrating the story for them. And so they end up believing not so much what they see is happening, although there's a lot going on. They end up believing and remembering what the commentator said, right? That's narrative storytelling, that you've lost your control over what you saw, because now you're engaging in the narrative of someone else. We see that in political ads, right? Where one candidate says this, another candidate says that. And so we learn that there's basically six types of those stories. There's a story that you tell yourself to yourself. There's a story you tell yourself about others. And then there's the reverse. There's the others, or the adversary or the competitor has a story that they tell themselves. And then they have a story that they tell about you. And so we've been engaged in the story that our opponents, our competitors, our adversaries have been telling about us. And so we've been reacting to that story for a number of years. And so people like Senghor, President Senghor, and Nyeri, and Nkrumah, they talked about creating their own stories, right? But we have to go further than that. We have to have strategic stories, strategic, sustainable stories, right? To build on 300,000 years of storytelling, because that's what allowed us to survive. That makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm getting closer, and I think the audience is also trying to map it out. So, like the words slavery, colonization, or we were enslaved or colonized, it's a narrative that has been put on us. Is that what we should understand?
Right. First off, slave is not an identity, right? Slave is a political label that was ascribed and put on people. Number two, the word slave comes from Eastern Europeans known as Slavs, right? That's where the word comes from. But their historical experience, at least 200 or 300 years ago, were that they were put in bondage by other Europeans. And so because they were in bondage to other Europeans, the notion of bondage became Slav, right? And from Slav, when you put an E on the end, you get slave, and then that was ascribed to who? African people. You know, we are not Slavs, but we shared an experience with Slavs. And I had the privilege about 10 years ago of engaging the consulate of the Czech Republic on that very same notion. I asked him, well, how did your heritage, your ethnic name Slav, become the brand for bondage slave? And I end up learning that there's a whole story behind that, which I talk about in the introduction to my book called We Were Never Slaves. That we have to understand that what happened to us is not who we are, right? Slave is a label. It is not an identity. There was never a transatlantic slave trade. There was transatlantic human trafficking, right?
Okay.
Because you say slave, but then you deny the humanity of the people who were being trafficked. So when you say slave, well, that means those people had no stories, they had no legacy, they had no families, they were nobodies, nobodiness. And so whenever we use that word, we deny our own humanity. And so we should never, ever call our ancestors slaves. They were captives. In fact, that's what the Portuguese called them when Portugal started the whole enslavement process back around 1442. They were called ransom. The Africans taken from the northwest coast of Africa were called ransom captives, right? They were taken for ransom, and then someone paid the ransom in Portugal or other parts of Europe. When they were taken to Brazil, someone paid the ransom, right? Because they were ransom captives. They weren't called slaves. Even when we read in the Judeo-Christian Bible, originally the words were not slave, they were servants, right? And so there were strategic mistranslations in the Bibles. And so now, particularly in English, I don't know about in German or French, but some verses where it says, slaves, obey your masters.
Correct.
That's what was told to the African captives in the United States and in Canada and in Brazil and in Colombia and in Bolivia, that you were destined by God, their God idea, to be subservient. But that's not originally what it said, right? We were called enemies of Christ by a pope because he despised Africans as morally disgusting, right? And I talk about that in this book. And so there's a number of papal bulls or executive orders issued that led to the expansion of human African trafficking from South Africa. People don't want to talk about that, but there were, quote, captive Africans in South Africa. There's a slave castle in South Africa, just like in Ghana and Senegal, but we don't talk about that. Or on the East Coast, off the coast of Mozambique and Kenya. And so we have to gain control over our narrative, our stories.
Even in Cameroon, Limbe, we also have that.
Yes, right. But we shouldn't refer to and I've been to Dakar, that you're entering into a slave castle. No, they were they were torture chambers, right? That's really what it was. The plantations weren't plantations, they were prison camps, right? The boats which our people crossed Atlantic on, those weren't slave ships, those were floating prisons. And so we have to change the narrative. We have to gain control over our story. And so that's what I talk about in this book, which will be out later this year.
Oh, this is so, this is so, I don't know how I can say it. I mean, this is something new. And we never thought about it. If we look at even today, the situation of human trafficking. So it is even not possible that we look at our oppressors or those that perpetuated this illegal act and call it human trafficking. So we even begin to say we were enslaved, as if we're owning up to that narrative, isn't it?
Oh, we have to own up to what happened, right? Something has happened to us, right? As a people. As a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Wade Nobles, a psychologist, he talks about there's the damaged human narrative, and then there's the divine human narrative, right? And so we've been emphasizing, re-narrating the damaged narrative that we have de-emphasized or don't talk about the divine narrative, right? That something happened outside of Johannesburg 300,000 years ago that is really profound. And that's when these people named Homo naledi, right? And naledi is a Zulu social word for star. And so they're called the star people for short. They made an entrance to a nearly inaccessible cave system, and they buried their dead there. They held, I believe, rituals. And this was the first documented realization of our transcendent life, our spiritual life. And so they began telling that story. about what they discovered, that we're more than just this body, right? This is not who we are. This is not what this is. This is a shell for our divinity. And that's the story that African people have to retell ourselves, that we are divine spiritual beings having a human experience, not the other way around. And so that narrative, which is talked about a little bit in this book here called African Cosmos, right? Mm-hmm. How African people began looking at the stars many years ago, thousands of years ago, and constructed narratives. Every African society, every human society has a story about their origins. And their origins typically all begin not on Earth, but out there in the stars. And then when we start studying astrophysics, there's a field called astrobiology, right? And you realize that our bodies are composed of stardust. And so when our ancestors said, we are stars, or look to the stars, that they were referring back in time to where we came from, that we are spiritual beings. And so that's got to be part of any sustainable development. We have to have sustainable stories that talk about who we are as a people and reclaim that narrative. You see what I'm saying? We can't just be in survival mode, in reactionary mode to this or that. You know, there's confusion and chaos happening in Ethiopia right now. There's confusion and chaos happening in other African countries, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Colombia, in the United States, in Europe, right? We're just reacting. We have to create what I say a possibility space for a parallel story. The Chinese have their story, right? And so their story is, is in great competition with the European story. European, I'm including United States, Canada, and Europe. And so they're competing with them. India has a story. They have their own narrative. African people have a story too. We're just not telling it to ourselves, right? That's one of the things that I admired by Ryan Coogler's film, Black Panther, is that he attempted to meld different themes, African themes, into the one picture. Although a lot of Africans criticize the film, oh, well, it didn't represent this or that, right? But that wasn't his point. His point was to find a way through storytelling to show how we're all connected. And so that's something that I want to emphasize that we have to do more of. And that's something that, I've been talking about. I've done workshops, lectures, consultancies on strategic storytelling, but also using our brains as the background, as the basis for that. Not just simply, and that's something that marketers do, right, to persuade us to buy this product or that product, right? There's a whole field called neuromarketing, where they're using brain science so companies can persuade us, the public, the consumers, to buy their products. And so, we can do the same thing. We're engaging in storytelling all the time, but it's just not strategic. We have to raise our level of play in this new field, particularly the digital age. That's why I appreciate your platform, because your platform is a profound way of getting our stories out to people all over the world. And so I thank you for inviting me to be on your show. And I have lots of things to say, but I don't want this just to be a one-way conversation. I don't know if there will be moments, when a few people from the audience can engage, but I'm just so grateful for this invitation.
We are so grateful, and you're going to get your feedbacks. But like, we're so hungry. Yeah. The knowledge that you're giving us is another, like, I just want to shut up here and just listen, just be going. There would come that time. We have 2 hours, and we're even Saturday, we have 2 more hours, depending on the time that you have, because we don't ever have the space and the time to sit back and reflect and get this kind of pertinent solutions
Right.
from our experts and scholars like you. So we're so grateful and thankful that you're here to teach us, yeah, to really teach us what is it that never any other person, not even a greater scholar, has taught. Now, you talked about shortly a while ago about these agendas. We have the Sustainable Development Goals for Africa 2030, and then we
Right.
have Africa We Want agenda for 2063. I mean, if you look at even both agendas, it's just the same thing. I keep asking myself, why 130 and the other 163 or 33
Right.
years after? Anyway,
Right.
but the issue is what is missing.
What is missing? And the European Parliament Commission on Civil Liberties and Justice, they had a resolution 2018-2899 on the fundamental rights of people of African descent of Europe. It was adopted in March of 2019. And this resolution urges the European Union member states to confront structural anti-Black racism, Afrophobia, and ongoing injustices. But how are African people in Europe responding to that? How many African people in Europe know that that resolution exists, know how to participate in the process? I have a dear friend who's a member of parliament in Sweden, Mamadou Jaro, and you know him,
Yes.
and he's been urging various organizations in Europe to get behind this fight, and that's good. But we have to have a coherent story, right, in that struggle. But right now, our story is like the sunlight; it shines in all directions. But we need a laser force, a laser-like focus on our stories to get what we imagine, rather than just reacting to a resolution, whether it's the European Parliament's resolution, whether it's United Nations resolution, even here. I participated in 2016 in the Charter for the African Cultural Renaissance that was held in Johannesburg, right? It's an amazing document. But one of the things that's still missing is creating a possibility space for our stories. Because if we don't tell our stories the way we want to tell them, well, then someone else will be telling our stories. And that's what we're having. Someone else has fragmented our narrative. We don't have a coherent narrative where everyone can see clearly where they fit, no matter where they may be, whether it's in Europe, United States, on the continent, wherever African people may be, they can identify with what we call an African sensibility. And that African sensibility, as I said, developed or emerged 300,000 years ago. And that's what sustained us. You know, we're discounting 298,000 years of African development. We don't hear about that long view, right? We talk about Black Lives Matter in the United States. Well, when did Black Lives matter? We're told that Black Lives mattered when colonization and slavery happened. But so the when Black Lives Matter is important. But in my book, I talk about Black lives began to matter when Black spirits mattered. And that happened 300,000 years ago. And that's what sustained us. It sustained us through all types of climate changes and crises. It sustained us through droughts and wet seasons and dry seasons. It sustained us when there was hardly any food to live. And that's what motivated people to disperse across the continent and around the globe. But what they carried with them was their stories of how they sustained themselves, not just simply how they survived. And so there's an African sensibility that we have to re-recognize and re-narrate and reboot for today. Particularly, it's a lot easier because of the digital world that we're living in today, that we can reach thousands, millions of people at one time.
One thing that is striking me now, as you're just talking about this EU 2019 resolution, I think from my understanding, I saw that paper, but I thought we were not yet united and prepared and have one language to confront these resolutions.
Right.
So I'm looking at you bringing out a book, and this book for me should be like a handout, like the roadmap. When we all understand this agenda that you're trying to present, then we can start engaging in this resolution. What do you think about that?
I totally agree with that. Is that one of our problems is that we don't have all the information. We're in information silos. You know, someone in Zimbabwe has this, someone in South Africa has this, someone in Cameroon or Ghana has this, someone in the United States has this information, someone in Brazil has this. But we're not talking to each other to share and to dialogue, to see what are the best strategies that can come out of what we already know, right? So we have to have communication channels where we can hear each other and learn how to trust each other again, because many African people still, we've learned to mistrust ourselves. We got caught up in nationalism narratives that I want my own land. You know, I don't want to be a part of this. Well, the truth is, you know, in 1888, 89, all the borders for the present African countries were created. And so those states didn't exist prior to that. At least those borders didn't exist prior to that. You know, you had localized city-states, right, which communicated with one another, which traded with one another. Because, you know, it's really sad to see cousins fighting cousins.
Oh, yeah.
The same people, basically. But that's part of how the Africa that we know, that we experience, that we live has been constructed, not for our benefit, but for others' benefit. And so once we reboot our sensibility, then we can begin to gain control over the resources that we have, right?
Yes. Thank you. I mean, I really appreciate this, because particularly I'm still focused on this EU resolution. Sometimes I don't trust the systems anymore, that they bring a resolution, they understand perfectly well that we're not going to meet up with it because we're fragmented, what they originally created. So the strategy, my opinion or your opinion, would be like, we are not going to say pay us reparations for enslaving us. So it's going to be like human trafficking.
Well, that's an explosive topic, the notion of reparations. I talk about in terms of healing the harm, that there was harm done. And in my book, I talk about a ledger of harms, right? And I identified 24 specific harms that were done, right? Particularly to those who were trafficked to the Western Hemisphere, to South America and North America. And so the whole notion of reparations means to repair the damage, but there's internal damage, There's the damage of violence, what I call invisible violence. That's the violence we don't see, but the violence we live every day, right? Some people call them microaggressions. Well, they're really not microaggressions. It's really aggression, period. But it's a form of invisible violence. It's everyday violence that we find ourselves in, at least in the diaspora. And so there has to be acknowledgement of what happened. You know, still in the United States, there's many people who don't look like you and I, who don't want to acknowledge what happened, that crimes were committed. And speaking of that, there was a Dutch jurist, his name was Peter Droos, during the Genocide Convention back in the 1950s. He argued that there were crimes of state committed against African people, particularly, and also Asians. And he said, not Hunter, he said that there needs to be remedy for these crimes of state. And he listed what they were. And he had a term called humanicide. That was his term that he used. And the point was that rather than adopt his proposed resolution, we got the Declaration of Human Rights, right? That's how the Declaration of Human Rights came about, because certain member states, you know, like the United States, did not want to adopt his notion of humanicide, crimes of state, because if they did, well, then that would make them vulnerable to suits for what that government did to the captive Africans. And so instead, we got the positive reframing of that in terms of human rights, that all humans have a right for so and so and so and so, civil rights, political rights, cultural rights, but not what happened. We have to acknowledge what happened. In Portugal, for example, Prince Henry the Navigator is still celebrated without remorse or regret in huge steel and stone statues, right? So what he did were really crimes, but those crimes in their eyes were virtuous. They were valorous. And so we have to reframe all of that. And so part of reparations, and I'm not saying that the United States government is ever going to pay the descendants of the captives anything, but it is a big debate happening, a contentious debate. And I'm all for that debate, but we have to do things to heal ourselves, repair the damage to ourselves. Because one of the things that happens is that when people experience trauma, and there's many different types of trauma, adverse child experiences can be traumatic. There's historical trauma. What happened on the quote slave ships, that was traumatic. But the thing about it we know now is that that trauma can be passed on to succeeding generations. There's something known as epigenetics, where genes can turn off or turn on based on previous experience. And so when we watch, for example, a police officer in Chicago or Minneapolis or wherever the case may be, shoot and kill someone of African descent or Latino descent, that brings up the memories of when that happened before. Even if you watch it on TV, even if you watch it in a movie, you watch 12 Years a Slave, it re-traumatizes us as a people. And so we are reliving an experience, even though we didn't have physically that experience. But, you know, there's a field of neuroscience called social neuroscience, is that when we see something, sometimes it vicariously presents those images internally. And so we end up something called mirror neurons, or the mirror neuron system. And so it works off imitation. And so we make models of the world, and we're engaging those models within ourselves. And so we're engaging someone else's models of African people right now. And so we continually get the same fragmented results. And so we have to have different models of ourselves. And I suggest that that model should be based on something that sustained us for 300,000 years. And so that's why I focus on that, not just the last 500 years, because that's just a small percentage of 300,000 years of African development.
Good. Yeah. So it's like we always starting from the history when slavery or human trafficking began, but we forget about what we were. And this is exactly the question we've been asking. How were we before this, this dreadful incident happened to us? All right. But the other issue is we talked about colonization. And if we look at colonization, it means that they trafficked the ones that they stole, actually, illegally, trafficked the ones from the continent to the diasporas where they are. And then on the continent, they colonized. And we're using always the narrative of colonization. I mean, if you look at our system, our education, our church religions and stuff like that, I mean, are they of our origins? And so, or now even the issue of getting these systems into our own, what happened? There must have been some sort of corruption. There must have been some sort of manipulation or something like that. What's your opinion?
Well, that's, many people far more qualified than me have written about that. That when you have an occupying force, right, who has superior weapons, right, you can be tricked into doing things that you don't see the consequences of down the road.
Correct.
Our ancestors didn't see the consequences of trafficking war captives, for example, right? They didn't see the consequence of where that was going to go. They didn't understand the people that they were dealing with. They had imagined them just as a lighter skinned version of their own adversaries. But they didn't know that those people had an entirely different agenda. They had an entirely different anthropology. They had an entirely different theology. They had an entirely different sociology based on their own experiences in Europe. And so they didn't know that. They didn't see that. They didn't have an opportunity to strategically have a plan to encounter that type of adversary. And so they were at a tremendous disadvantage.
Exactly.
And so that was, and because they were exploited. And so the colonizers exploited their fragmentation, and we're still being victimized by that same method of exploitation today. We're fragmented. But I contend that's a given, but we can do better than that. We can, as I keep saying, we can create a possibility space of a parallel African future, that engages the rest of the world. I'm not saying that we should be isolated or we should attempt to dominate other people. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that how do we want to see ourselves 5, 15, 50 years from now? Do we see ourselves in the same condition as fragmented people? Or do we see ourselves as being innovative spiritually, right? We're kind of stuck in, this is not a criticism of spiritual ways that's not leading to our liberation. It's leading to our containment within this narrative structure that we find ourselves in that's not our own, because we're not producing knowledge. 300,000 years, we produce knowledge that sustained ourselves. That's how we got here. But now we are in a mashup of other people's ideas, but we have to unbox the African ideas. African people had ideas of morality, of ethics, of politics, right? We had those, but now we see a mashup of those with other people's ideas, with the colonizers' ideas, what I call the colonizers' code. And we get caught up in the trickster equation, right? We've been tricked, we've been hoodwinked, we've been bamboozled, as Malcolm X said, we've been led astray from ourselves. So how can we get back to ourselves? And we get back to ourselves by really studying ourselves as to who we are and what we are, where we come from, where do we want to go? So it's a process. And I'm just grateful to be a part of many brilliant people that I've engaged with all over the world in this process of reclaiming, rebooting, restarting the world.
Right. That sounds what we would be doing. I'm still really a little bit kind of looking for a kind of a situation where African has to create its legal system and hold all and hold accountable all this act that were done to its people in this 500 years.
Right.
I think that should be a place where we now say, like from the perspective of we are living together in a global world space and we are trading with others. Up till now, there is still the exploitation and everything going on. They're not even ready to sit on the table and even acknowledge all the things that were done. And I think building ourselves, we've been always trying to just walk away and just heal ourselves and just go our way. Now, when is it going to be that period that we think, yes, while we're developing to go away, but somebody has to pay for all this. We need the money to rebuild the continent. Where's that money going to come from?
Oh, we can have internal trade. One of the things that I like about what's happening in South Africa is the raising up of a Zulu and Xhosa notion of Ubuntu, right? Of the whole notion that we exist, I exist because you exist. We are because I am. But it's more than just that, though. Not something that Desmond Tutu said, but the whole idea of that type of jurisprudence, of that type of legal structure. And, I wish other Africans on the continent and elsewhere would embrace that whole idea, because the whole notion of ethics, for example, comes out of our experience. Every African culture, and I've studied quite a few, have their own ideas about morality and ethics. Unfortunately, those ideas tend not to be transferred into the political space. They tend to be only in the religious or spiritual space. But, I feel that our ethics and morals need to be translated into the political space, in the technological space, particularly in the technological space. Because if we don't do the code, someone is going to code us out of existence, right? Because the coders, the people doing the codes for all the computer systems, all the platforms, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Twitter, they're all white guys for the most part. And so they bring their biases when they're doing the coding. And so those biases, there's a number of movies there's a movie called Coded Bias that's on Netflix that talks about facial recognition, which is big in China and in London with all the cameras everywhere. But they're not trained to properly recognize African faces. And so when they do recognize African spaces, they're misrecognized as a criminal. And so we have to learn about all these little things that's happening that impact our development, our identities, and who we are. And so we have to have this space where we create ourselves, right? Where we tell our own stories, where we have a strategic story that raises ourselves up. That's one of the things that's so profound about Egypt, where we say Kemet, is that the whole notion of raising yourself out of ruin, out of recklessness, into liberation. You know, every May 25th, there's African Liberation Day, right? And so I think this time we have to talk about liberating our stories from a story of survival and stereotypes to a story of sustainability.
I mean, it's thank you so very much. I mean,
I know that's
I actually went into a lot of things, but when I look at your biography here, we have a lot. And I don't know how many sessions and teachings we're going to do with you here, because there's just so much that even though we envelope it in it, the story or the topic today is actually, as you said, importance of a strategic and sustainable African stories from our own point, from the African perspective.
Right.
Yeah, and you talked about your interest also in chemology. I call it chematology. We say Egyptology.
Right.
Why?
Right. Well, particularly, you know, people go to Egypt or Kemet and they see the incredible temples and they see the pyramids. You know, then some people hypothesize who built the pyramids. You know, we learned that aliens built the pyramids. Of course, that's not true, because they found the graves of the pyramid builders outside of the pyramids. I know the Egyptologist, I met him, 20 or so years ago. His name is Mark Lehner. He actually found the graves of the builders of the pyramids in Giza. And they worked based off cooperative competition, that they competed against each other as to who can be the best, just like on the football field or on the basketball court. People are competing, but they're cooperating at the same time. No slaves built anything in Egypt. That's absolutely unequivocally true. There were no slaves, quote. They didn't even have a word to describe in Medu Neter, the language for such a person in bondage. It never happened, right? Those were skilled people. Yes, there were, you could say, conscripted laborers that did some of the heavy lifting, but the actual workmanship, you see, when you go there, you see that you couldn't force anyone to do that type of work, right? And so when we look at the monuments, what very few people talk about is what was the underlying moral and ethical basis for doing that in the first place. And in Kemet, that was known as Mayat or Ma'at. It can be pronounced many different ways, spelled M-A-A-T. And that was the basis. Their cosmology was not human-centered, right? All ethical systems today in Europe or in China, Asia, they're human-centered. That was cosmic-centered, and human beings were part of this, quote, cosmos, the universe. And that's fundamentally different from a human-centric or anthropological-centric idea of ethics and morals, because they were concerned about life in its totality. So everything was divine. Now we get notions of that's animism, and so that's some woo woo woo. We don't want to deal with that because they're saying there's a spirit in the rock, there's a spirit in the plant. Well, that's how they understood energy, right? And now, we know from quantum mechanics or quantum theory that everything really is energy, that we are energy beings. And so our ancestors understood that years ago. It's something, when I went there last December, there's something called the winter solstice ceremony at the Temple of Karnak in Luxor. And if you go to Egypt, please go so you can witness that. And what you witness when the sun rises, it rises and it shines through a tiny portal, and the light strikes a granite altar in the sanctuary of Amen, or that which is hidden, and it lights up that entire space. It's something profound to see that they constructed monuments that was aligned to the sun, that the whole notion of astronomy began on the continent. People talk about in London, oh, there's Stonehenge, right? Well, there's something equivalent in Senegal, in Zambia, in Sudan, in South Africa. But how did these people in these disparate places learn all of this? Well, they traveled and they communicated and they taught each other. And so I contend that we can teach each other about our own history. That's not in the history books. If you go into libraries on the continent, a lot of this stuff isn't there because they were colonial projects, right? Mm-hmm. I wrote about the Dogon years ago and their astronomical knowledge. But one of the things that people forget was that the anthropologists who did the studies, they were part of the French colonizing project. And so they were there to extract as much information as they could from the Dogon, the Bambara, and so forth and so on, so the French could better manage their colonial project in those countries. And so the stories that we get about the Dogon and others are French stories. That's not the stories that they tell each other. And so we've been misled. We talk about the pale fox, right? Or Yurugu. And we ascribe, some people ascribe that to the Europeans, but it's the European story of the Dogon. We have to get that clear. And so we have to capture our own stories again to heal this fragmentation, to bring ourselves together.
Ashe. Wow, you were invited in Kemet by one of our greatest scholar and expert also, Dr. Tony Browder, in December 2020, now as guest speaker. We all know that you've been the top guest speakers amongst all, touring around, just giving this particular information out there. That's why we're still very, very thankful that we can actually host you or even have that privilege, to have you share this platform with us. You've been flown out to very unique occasions to actually give out this knowledge for free, just like you're giving to us, our people. So I really appreciate all of you that are watching and following this show. Please, we are more than close to 140 on YouTube, and we're just having 40 likes. That's unfair to have a professor here. So please smash the like buttons. And if you're here for the first time, make sure you subscribe to this channel. When you were hosted by Tony Browder in Morocco this year, in Egypt this December, what was the topic and what did you lecture about?
Oh, actually, I didn't give any lectures this time. I was there to witness his excavation. He has an excavation project called the Asa Restoration Project, and he is excavating tombs of Kushite kings in outside of Luxor, in what's known as the Valley of the Kings and Queens and Nobles. What a lot of people don't know is that there were also members of the Kushite dynasties, which was the 25th and 26th dynasties. People like to call them the Black Pharaohs to distinguish them from the others. But the fact is that almost all of Egypt was African. I participated and was a consultant to an exhibit in Chicago called the Africa exhibit. It's a permanent exhibit. If you're ever, I welcome you to Chicago. I'll give you a guided tour if you come. And one of the things that we fought for, the people who were developing this exhibit, which is a huge exhibit, is the whole notion that we were told, the curator said, Egypt is not part of Africa, right? And we went around and around and around debating the museum staff that Egypt is in Africa. Just look at a map, you can see it, because they have a separate exhibit on Egypt, but they didn't want to connect them together. And so what they end up doing, they have a huge map, maybe 20 meters by 20 meters. And the heading says, between the two exhibits, the Africa exhibit and the Egypt exhibit. And it says, the headline, Egypt is in Africa. But the exhibits still aren't connected. And so we find today that Egypt, when we think of Egypt, and that's a Greek name, and they didn't call their country 5,000 years ago Egypt, it was Kemet, or the land of the Black people, or land of the Blacks, a lot of different names, variations on that. But that's a Greek name. And so we have to reclaim that. And so one of the things that my dear friend and colleague, Professor Tony Browder, is doing is that he is retelling that part of the story, right? And excavating now, it started off with 2, and I think now there's 8 tombs that they found. And last November, they found something known as a pyramidion, or the capstone to a pyramid. And now that's in the Luxor Museum, a special exhibit. And so I was there for the opening of that. But it was really amazing to witness a live excavation in process, to go down inside these tombs of our ancestors, to see people with an array of skill sets from around the world working with him on this project. Renowned Egyptologists, many of them European, some of them Pakistani, working with this brother, my brother, because they wanted to be a part of something big. You know, there's a Russian woman who's collaborating with him on this project. And so it was amazing to be a part of that, to witness what they were doing. And they finding some amazing things about our history. One of the things that they found, you know, in Ghana, there's the whole notion of Sankofa, right? You know, there's 2 symbols for a Sankofa. We have the Sankofa bird, that the bird is turning around backwards to go and fetch history. And then we also have something that looks like a heart. Well, guess what? That symbol was on the ceiling of one of the tombs that they found. But this was 3,000 years ago. And so that idea was transferred or carried when the invaders came and the Africans fled westward and southward. They brought those symbols with them, many symbols, many ideas. And so there's, as Shayanta Diop talks about, there's a cultural unity of African people, and that we find the same ideas distributed all over the continent, but they're incoherent, they're fragmented. We don't see the connections, but now many of us are beginning to see those connections. And that's a wonderful thing when we see how this basic sensibility connects us. And so I appreciate your platform to help get the word out on how we're connected so we can begin to build businesses, to trade with one another. You know, there's no reason why Africa has to depend upon other economies outside of itself to develop. You know, there should be no reason why the tragedy that happened today with the migrants fleeing their countries to go to Europe, what they believe as the promised land, or coming to the United States, believing it's the promised land. It's not promised. It wasn't promised to us, right? Because we weren't brought here according to a Supreme Court justice to be a part of this body politic here in the United States. We were brought here to serve this body politic, not be a part of it. That's a very important distinction. And so it's a tragedy. It hurts my heart when I see, you know, hundreds of migrants fleeing their countries. You know, it brings to mind, what are their countries not doing to develop themselves? That we have to have a different type of leadership. This is not necessarily a critique, but a leadership that recognize our inherent value. Because for 300,000 years, we were self-validating. We validated ourselves. But now we seek validation outside of ourselves. We believe that some people's water is purer and better than our own water. We believe that some people's food is better than the food that we grow ourselves. But I tell you, there's nothing like a Ghanaian pineapple. You know, when I had a Ghanaian pineapple, it was like in heaven. There's nothing like an Egyptian watermelon. You know, those are the best watermelons in the world. And that's one of the reasons why we don't see them represented in the artwork, because they whited them out. Because if they knew that Africans in Kemet ate watermelons, well, then that would destroy the stereotype of us in the United States eating watermelons like there's nothing else to do. And so we have to reclaim the nuances of our own history, of our own value system. And that's one of the things that we can do, is to validate ourselves. And when we validate ourselves, we can create economies to validate ourselves that can sustain ourselves.
Okay, I think you need a short break, and we would be taking in your calls and your comments and questions, if any, on this very interesting topic. Africans were never enslaved nor colonized, and we're here talking about actually the stories that are being told, and even the narratives, and even the terminology and the key words, until we ourselves are adopting these words to say, oh, you know, we were enslaved in this. No, the real word is human trafficking, as we've all learned here today. And for those that came in late, we just gave a break-in, and this break-in, we're going to be talking about it on Tuesday when we resume here. The 41 African migrants that died today crossing over to Europe, among other babies on this boat. I mean, the images are horrible, and the United Nations Human Rights Committee for Refugees actually confirmed these sources today. And so we're really sharing our condolence out there. And the reason why we keep talking about this, like he's saying, I mean, in those days, we even knew it was human trafficking. So it wasn't even like it was a crime against us. But this day, we actually pay even to incriminate ourselves into this. So what kind of a trauma is that? How can we relate to that? That Africans, young, energetic, our brains that we're crying to keep on the continent would be fleeing, and not just even fleeing, right? But they're choosing the ocean. It means like it's a do or die. What is it that can make an African really just hate Africa? So much so that they choose to die at the oceans. A lot of them are saying, yes, I preferably die down there than to stay in this misery. Ignorance, miseducation, poor stories, negative narratives about them, all these particles of our stories is what join and combine all this yeah, to provide information of a better paradise somewhere. We also think that strategically it is also plan, systematic plan to drive away our young people, come here and enslave them in another because of the aging population out here. And not only out here, we just talking in any places that would go. So it's some kind of like a branding marketing strategy, like, no, we are good and fine. But of course, we also know that after coming out here like migrants, like refugees, you begin to see the realities of the true story of it. We also have to experience that even the people and the countries themselves have their own challenges to deal with. That is the reality of the African on the continent. And today we want to sensitize ourselves, educate ourselves. What is it that we can do? It is not about not asking any African to travel out of Africa. Let us get this clear. It is about how should they travel, their legal means to travel. And we on the Pan African Daily TV are looking forward to actually help you out there if you want to travel for study, for work, to, for family, or for touring. Please contact us. We are going to direct you. We're going to give you reliable information and context how you can travel out of Africa for whatever purpose you want. But choosing and paying to die in the oceans, that should not be the dream of any African child, irrespective of what your situation is, where you are. It is still the paradise that you don't know until you leave it. Yes. So we are taking questions, we're taking calls, and you know how to do it. Call using our WhatsApp line +491578 2112379. It will be interesting. A feedback, particularly our professor here wants to hear from you what you think. Anyway, while we're waiting for your calls to come in, we have been talking about a lot of things here, and I still would go back into your biography because it's so interesting, it's so rich, and I'll pick up some small statements inside, and we talk about it. Like I saw here, you wrote clearly, as a child in Sunday school, a white boy told him, "You people are like the Hebrews in the Bible, slaves." Yeah, this words moved him then. And now, I mean, like you. And now, to boldly address the invisible violence of oppression, this book is the culmination of a lifelong commitment to change the story of Africana lifestyle and a testimonial for rejuvenating hope. I mean, when are we expecting to have this book? Because when is it going to be available?
Well, I've been working on it now for 11 years. And so I expect it will drop certainly in the late fall of this year.
Beautiful.
And I will definitely let you know when that happens, because I want to launch it in a lot of places simultaneously. So there will be, of course, a printed version, a ebook version, and later an audio version as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. What is it? Just like stories or memories or more of teaching, isn't it?
Well, the book starts off raising the question, something that Dr. Martin Luther King said, that he said someone told a lie one day. They said everything black is ugly and evil. And so that has motivated me ever since I heard him say that. And so we start by getting our language straight. That was the thing that he said. We've got to get the language straight. And so I start off by saying that millions of years ago, before the fall, what was our source story, right? Before the fall. And by that, I mean before Europeans came and later others, Arabs and others, came and colonized us, is that we had a story, we had a way of life, we had a way of living, a way of being, a way of thinking, a way of relating with everything in our environment, including the sky. That was our story. That's what sustained us for 300,000 years. And so we have to return to that. And so when I look at, maybe 3 million years of human development, right, as to how we gain all these capabilities. For example, I talk about evidence of the first bed was found in South Africa, dated to around 30,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Not just people sleeping on leaves, but they had constructed a bed. That the whole notion, why do sisters adorn themselves with jewelry? Okay, well, that practice started maybe 80,000 years ago of punching holes in cowrie shells and making necklaces, right?
Mm-hmm.
But our sisters, African women, don't know that. They don't know the whole notion of face decoration, of painting, developed 100,000 years ago, right? And so we're carrying on those traditions, but we don't know where they came from. It's not in our history books. It's not in our textbooks. We don't pass on that story. We just do it. And so this first chapter is talking about before the fall. And then we go into narrative warfare, because we have to see what has happened to us is that we've been caught up in some competing narratives about ourselves. And so now there's tremendous partisanship taking place in the United States, liberals versus conservatives, Democrats, social democrats, Republicans, Tories, and that type of thing, right?
Okay. All right. There's some calls coming in. I think we,
Okay.
yeah, while we were waiting on them, you're live now. Hello? Yes. Fine. Your volume is a little bit low. Let me see. Or mine. Okay. Here. Go.
Okay, this is Keith. I'm calling from the States, Detroit. I have Dr. Havlin. You have really been dropping some serious knowledge, and you're like a piano. You're all over the place, and it's very, very wonderful food for the soul. So I truly appreciate that. You said a couple powerful statements. You said one of the statements you said is we Africans and Africans throughout the world and the continent, we're not telling or producing knowledge.
Yes.
And I think you have a very strong point on that, but I think we are. We just don't. We're not weaving it together, like you just spoke about the cowrie shells for women. But I had an experience a while back, and I want you to help me to figure out how to move past it. I sometimes I can't sleep, and so I'll get up and I'll start Instagramming, and I saw one of the Egyptian statues, and it looked like a friend of mine. Very flat face, cheeks, and the eyes, the slanted eyes. So I commented on it. Beautiful. I woke up that morning, and some guy told me that I was full of shit, and he just proceeded to curse me out on Instagram. So I don't argue over on platform. I don't do that. So I just in a small letters like what did I say so wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And then he began to tell me that myself, us Black Americans and sub-Saharan Africans think that that we are Egyptians, that we have no right to that. And I mean, he just was like rude. And I was like, well, how did you come up with that conclusion? And then within that paraphrase, I said, well, you must be either European or Arabic. And so that leads me to this very question: is when I saw the marching of those Egyptian pharaohs by the Egyptians, and by the Arabics, and I'm seeing that the historical images of Africans and Nefertiti's are being more, I gotta say, designed to look more Mediterranean. That was like a kick in my gut. And it just felt like something was taken and marred against me of who I am. And as an African outside of the continent, when I want to focus on where my home base is, am I connected to Egypt? Should I connect that? Should I connect myself to the sub-Saharan Africans and to Egypt as well? That's the question.
Oh, that's a very simple question. Is that we are local, but we're global at the same time, right? We have to recognize that when we say African, we are talking about African not as an idea, but something beyond that. We're talking about ourselves in this global context. And so you may identify with Kemet, you may identify with the Zulu, you may identify with the Congo or the Wolof, and that's okay, right? But they're all part of something larger. There's a larger unity, and that's what Shayanta Diop talked about, the cultural unity. And so we can have local phenotypical differences, but the truth of the matter is, when I was in Aswan, Egypt, back in September, in December, until I spoke, people thought I was a local, right? Because I looked like the local people in Aswan, right? I was in Kenya some decades ago, and I was in a bar right outside of the United Nations Plaza, and a brother said, "Hello, my brother, how are you? I haven't seen you in a while." And I said, "Well, you haven't seen me before." He said, "Oh, I saw you in Khartoum. You are from Kenya." Right? And I told him, "I've never been to Khartoum." He said, "No, I've seen you." And so I pulled out my driver's license and I showed him, that I'm from Chicago. He said, "Oh, we can make those here." So the point I'm saying is that when you travel the continent, you're going to see someone who looks like you or looks like your family member.
Absolutely.
And so we have to identify with the totality of the continent and not be caught up on these phenotypical localized differences in how we look. But the issue is, what is the spirit, right? And when we focus on the spirit of the people, then we see that we're unified, we're one people. And so that's what we need to focus on, and not just, "Oh, well, I'm from Egypt." Yes, Egypt today is not what it was 3,000 years ago. They're not the same people, right? Except, we go to southern Egypt, in Aswan, the Nubians, they claim descent from the people of the dynastic era, but many of them are mixed with other people, with Palestinians and so forth. But they still identify, they still have the same cultural sensibility, right? When I was in Aswan, I passed a little cafe, and the cafe said Africa. And so they're very clear on who they were. And so that's what I would suggest that we focus on.
Okay. You're just saying the same thing. We had Professor Baena here, Baena Bello from the Haiti. And exactly that was the same thing. She was in Africa, and she was always confronted that somebody will run up to her, hug her, and like, "Oh, sister,
Yes.
since the last time we met." And when she went to Kenya or she went to Somalia, it was the same thing, that someone will hug her, or someone will remind her, or someone will even, talk to her really like, you were like. So, we're one.
The same thing when I was in Ethiopia, when I was in Senegal, the same thing. You run into people, at least I did, who could have been part of my family, right? My family here, who'd never been there. And so that's why I think, and those are amazing positive experiences when you're welcomed back into the family. Wherever we go, we're just one big family. And I think if we see ourselves as family, I'm not denying ethnic heritage, Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, Zulu, whatever the case may be, but we're still all part of this bigger family. And we see ourselves part of this bigger family, then I think that can facilitate how we can come together. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, the last chapter, is dark matter matters, right? There's a whole idea of dark matter, that most of the matter in the universe we can't see because it's hidden. And that's one of the things that in Kemet they talked about Amen, which referred the nature, or some say God, that which is hidden. And so much of our experience is hidden, but the darkness does matter, because the darkness is about possibility. The light emerges out of darkness. There's the dark parts of our brain. A lot of people, they see our skin melanin, oh, you're black, but there's 7 or so parts of our brain that are black. If you look at them under the microscope, there's something called neuromelanin, or melanated nerve cells, and that every human being has them. If you don't have them, then you would get diseases like Parkinson's disease or other movement disorders. And so we have to value the darkness, value the blackness. It shouldn't be a badge of dishonor and shame, which we've been socialized to accept, or a badge of oppression. Whenever they see someone black, oh, they're oppressed. They don't see the beauty and the spirituality of that blackness. And so that's one of the things that I talk about in the last chapter. And so we have to love ourselves. And so I have a chapter in the book called Welcome to Love Check. How much do we love ourselves, Dr. Tata? We ever ask the question, when do we give ourselves grace, right? Right. We have to give ourselves grace, not look for grace coming from beyond, from heaven, but we can give ourselves grace. We talk about fight the powers that be. Public Enemy talked about fight the power, fight the power. But there's a vocalist, Rochelle Burrell. I saw her a couple of years ago, and the sister said, show your power. Show your power and your love. Show your power and your compassion for each other. And so when we do that, when we do a love check to ask ourselves, am I loving myself? Am I loving my family? Am I loving my wife and my husband? Am I loving my children? Am I loving my people? Third World said, now that I found love, what am I going to do with it? Right? What are we going to do when we find this love? Right? And so we have to do something with it. We have to generate this love for ourselves, which is inherent. It's not something that we have to reach out and find. It's already within us, because we're having this experience of divine love. We've been given this gift of life, right, out of love of the entire universe. And so what are we going to do with it? We have to share it.
We can't wait for this book to come out. Please.
We got to rescue. Our minds are captive right now. Our minds are captured. It's not just decolonizing our mind. We got to rescue our minds from these stories that we keep telling ourselves, that we see in TV and the movies. Hollywood exists for a reason, and exists to create stories, narratives, to persuade people one way or another. Why is that most of the stories we see coming out of Hollywood or Bollywood or Nollywood deal with oppression, right? Deal with murder. How many stories do we see that are uplifting, that talk about possibilities? Africans have storytellers, so we have to tell different types of stories. There's a story that I saw years ago called Yelin, Brightness, talked about Bambara, right, in Mali. It was a fantastic story of a father resisting his son coming into knowledge. And so his father decided that he wanted to kill his son so he can protect himself, right? To protect his authority over the people, right? And so it's a fantastic film, and I urge folks to see that. There's lots of films across the continent that are inspiring. And so that's why we have to rescue our captive minds. We have to expand the circle of dignity, right? That all those who have died in the colonial area under enslavement, right? They were treated as nobodies. Their memory has been damned, right? And so we have to rescue their memory because those ancestors are part of us living today. We are them. We're carrying their energy within us. So what are we going to do? Do we just deny that it happened? No, we have to reclaim their memories, right? Memory is multi-directional. It goes to the past, it goes to the future too. And so we want our children to know what happened, why, so we can commemorate them. You know, there's statues all over Europe, all the United States, commemorating those who tortured and terrorized us, right? But not those who sustained us, who fought for us, right? And so we have to expand the whole notion of dignity to include our ancestors. And so that's another part of this book. You know, we have to understand how we've been framed. You know, the basic part of this book, you know, is based in neuroscience, right? How we respond to things based on someone else's story, someone else's frame. And so we talk about when you see a picture frame, the frame does what? It centers what's in the center of it, right? And so we have been framed, right? We have been framed as less than human. But even that's a problem. The whole notion of human, you know, we weren't included in being human, right? And so we have to look at the whole notion of being human, because current definitions of human, and you can look it up, it doesn't talk about the transcendent aspect of being human, you know, the spiritual aspect of being human. That is dis and denied, right? But that's fundamental to who we are. And so we have to look at the terms, the words. When we go back to Kemet, right? They had at least 9 different terms to describe, quote, a human being, right? 9 different terms: the personality, their energy, their body when they're deceased, their soul, and I can go on and on and on. We don't have time to talk about that now, maybe another time. But we have to reclaim the notion of what a human means. And that is an ongoing debate, particularly among Western intellectuals, on what is a human, you know, what was a slave, you know, quote, or someone captured. We don't know that there were huge debates among Western powers on what is a slave. And that's still going on. You know, when they talk about human trafficking today, what does human trafficking mean? Right? So we have to engage in that discourse on definitions, that we can have our own definitions. And our own definitions of, quote, human are going to be different from Western ideas of what human, Asian ideas of what human is, what the notion of reincarnation is. That African people have their own ideas. And so we have to value those ideas and put those ideas out here.
Okay.
And I think that can help bring us together.
All right. Thank you.
The time is going so fast.
I went so fast. I told you. Yeah, there are sessions. I used to remember. I mean, this is the hunger of an African about knowledge. Yeah. People want to learn. The eagerness, the awake. We all just getting up, and we want to gather so many. There are times we stay here for 4 hours just sharing this conversation. Anyway, let me pick up this call of the caller. He definitely has a question. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Good evening. Welcome.
Good evening. My
My name is Nanayao. I'm from Ghana, but I'm in the UK right now. And I'm listening to the program, and I want to make a little contribution.
Go ahead. Thank you very much.
You see, an African youth crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Europe looking for greener pastures or looking for the heaven, as you put it, it's not their fault. I can't blame them too much. I can use my country, your country, Ghana, as an example. Recently, I think 2 days ago, I was listening to a radio, and there is a report about the gold, amount of gold Ghana exported to the Europe, cost about almost $30-something billion. In the records of Switzerland, UK, and others, it shows that Ghana has exported gold, $30-something billion. But in the Ghanaian own records, in the government records, it's showing $20-something billion. So that difference, where did it go? So if that money is being put into the country, building infrastructure, creating jobs, opportunity, employment, and whatever, a young guy with a right frame of mind will leave, abandon the work in his country, and travel through this desert, don't even know his or her fate, whether he's going to make it or not, and say, I'm going to clean in a white man's land, or going to do a mini job in a white man's land, where he can be, respected as a king in his own land. No. Somebody struggled to have even a 1 square meal a day. A 1 square meal a day. And if you think I can hustle through this desert and go to somewhere that I can clean toilet and have a decent meal to eat, why not? So if we are talking, if these programs are, I suggest you call the African leaders, the authorities, the people who are in power, and question them about how are they using our resources.
Okay.
The white man talking about slaves.
Okay.
We're talking about slavery. We're talking about what's it called? European invasion and all that. You know. You want to say something?
Yes.
Continue.
No, I just want to thank you. This discussion about this refugee or these African migrants that lost their lives, we're going to have that topic on Tuesday. Today, we're talking about the stories, and we mentioned this incident that happened today as one of those stories that would be documented in another, exactly the point that you're saying. So the issue of the need for good governance on the continent should be addressed in order that the young people will stay at home. So those will be topics that we'll handle on Tuesday. So I kindly welcome you on the show on Saturday so we don't misrepresent the idea. Is it okay? But thank you so very much for your contribution. Yes, we're going to tackle that. And already we've been talking about that and holding our leaders accountable for that. But today we just want to focus on how do we, own our own narrative. Those are internal issues that we will deal with, but we're talking even about those issues that you cannot even control, and that is going to be manipulated, in a different manner. So thank you so much for your call. Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right. Over to you, sir.
Yes. Well, the caller makes a number of points. But that's a huge issue, internal political things, why people are leaving in the first place. That's a big issue that I'm not prepared today to tackle. I want to stay on message with this idea that we have to reclaim, reboot our own humanity, whatever that is. And that should be our focus, that if we don't have a clear idea of who we are as a people, then we're going to be in this continual turmoil that we will not find a way out. You know, there was a movie called Get Out a few years ago, and you may have seen that. It was about a guy who was trapped in something called the sunken place. And that's kind of where many of us as African people are. We're in this sunken place of someone else's story. It's not our own, someone else's way of being, someone else's narrative. And so we have to get out of that. We have to push through the trauma zone, right? We have to show up and show out our own story, our own way of being. We have to value ourselves rather than seeking validation outside of ourselves, because when we value ourselves, then we can create self-perpetuating economies and have more control over the vast resources that the continent has that are on the Caribbean islands. You know, we don't even talk about that, but many of the islands have more than just sandy beaches, beautiful beaches, and they are beautiful, but they also have resources too. And so we can learn how to create different systems of trade, of economic exchange, commercial exchange. And that's something that is possible. But to do that, we have to have what one of my teachers called, Dr. Bobby E. Wright, a psychologist, we have to have a social or life theory. What are the things that we value, right? How did they come to be valued? How do we know what we know? How do we value ourselves, right? These are very fundamental things, because if we don't have those, then we can't have a sustainable future, right? If we don't understand fully and appreciate fully who we are as a people, then we'll be caught up in someone's future that they planned for us, right? We have someone in the United States that wants to build a rocket ship to go to Mars and the moon. Okay, go ahead, right? But let us, even though that's a fantasy and that's not going to happen, at least not in centuries, right? But those futurists are imagining a future for us. Where are African people going to fit in their future, right? And their idea is that we're going to fit in the same subservient role to them, to others, whether it's the Europeans or Asians. That's how they see us in their future. But we are not creating a future where we see ourselves in relationship to them. They're not going to go away. But what we can do is to create a possibility space of our own future, a parallel existence to those where we are in control of our own existence. Right now, there's a war against our existence, you know, particularly being played out in the United States. I don't know about Europe, but there's a war against our existence. African people in the United States are criminalized since 1681. You know, our bodies are a weapon. They've been weaponized and they're criminals. You may have your hands up, but the police will still shoot and kill you. Oh, I was afraid. But you got the weapon. The other person had their hands up, and that's because they've been criminalized. There's laws on the books since 1681 where African people in the United States have been criminalized. We are born criminals. Every generation is going to be a criminal, right? And they use all types of race science tricks that we're genetically inferior. Of course, that's not true. You know, but many people believe that and accept that we're less than other people. And so that's the fundamental thing that we have to challenge and overcome, is that we are the first people. We're the original people. We can trace our lineage back 300,000 years or 100,000 years, whichever one you want to choose. And so that allowed us to get to this point, right? That all these cognitive and creative capacities that we see ourselves manifesting were built up over a long period of time, right? We love music. Music can unify us because it's all there, the same rhythms. I can go to Mali and hear the same rhythms in Mali that I could hear B.B. King play.
Correct.
But B.B. King he thinks that the blues came from Mississippi. But no, the blues came from Mali, right? Those chordal structures. My music teacher taught me that. Phil Coran taught me about the connectivity of African music. And he learned how to play all aspects of African music. In Chicago, at the planetarium, he composed a suite called African Skies, where he looked at the music across the continent, because African people focus on the sky, right? I talked about this book again, African Cosmos, right? Because that's how we related to something bigger. And so we can't just focus on our localized experiences, wherever they may be. They may be in Chad. They may be in Nigeria. They may be in Angola. We have to look at our global and cosmic experience and reclaim that. And that's the way that we can heal these wounds. We can remake and restart our world. That's our challenge. So how are we going to do that, Dr. Tata? How are the viewers? Now, I'm not expecting an answer, but I want the viewers to think about that. What can they do to restart the African world wherever they're at?
Can you show the book again? Can you just put it? Yes. We missed the book. Can you hold the book again? We missed it. You were showing it.
Right. African Cosmos. Right?
Okay.
It's an exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. that people can see, that talks about how African people related to the sky. There's things that we can do if we knew that they were there. We're caught up in our local situations, and I'm not dismissing them or belittling them. They're important, but we have to look at our global and cosmic situation and how we're related to something much larger than ourselves individually and ethnically and locally where we are.
Okay, correct. We've seen it. There is a question here in the chat. Where are Africans? Why are Africans not disguising who they were before 1100 BC? And where are the African historians speaking pre-900 BC?
Oh, there's all types of African historians. If you're in West Africa, well, then you know about the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai Empire. Mm-hmm. If you're in South Africa, you know about Great Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, we know about, there's African civilizations, but the problem is that we still have colonized libraries, right? African nations tend to be dependent upon European printing companies to print their books, right? We're just really getting into writing our own books, writing our own history. Yes, there's a lot of movies. There's a wonderful BBC series on Africa. Your viewers can look that out by a Sudanese woman. I can't remember her name right now, but I can text it to you. But there's all types. The information is out there. We just have to go and get it. We have to do our own research. We have to put that research into a format that can be distributed globally, right? And your platform and others' platforms can help do that. That's something that we can do. We don't have to wait. You don't have to have 100,000 euros to print your book on African history now. Now you can present your ideas on all these digital platforms, and there's a whole range of them. But we have to have some coherence to all of this, because a lot of people are all over the place and talk about a lot of nonsense and crazy things too. Right. And so there has to be curated knowledge that, and there's many people around the continent and here and in Europe that are doing just that. There's people doing great things, but we have to have this conversation globally, not just amongst our local selves.
Okay. The author of that story on BBC is Zainab Badawi, Queen Irege's.
Right.
That's right. We've been reaching out to her a couple of times to get her on the show. I don't know why, but we still think that there's still a lot less in it. And she was reporting on the point of view. What is it that we're educating the other communities? I mean, that's just what I read from the critics, from what was. It's not my own opinion. I don't represent it, but we actually reaching out to her. If we will be lucky to have her on the show. But I think that's an incredible documentary. I went through a couple of times as well. And usually when I go through that, I do my own research, and particularly I look at what people say about that, critics.
Right.
That's how we learn more. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a good point, is that the scholarship is out here. There's people doing incredible things everywhere. But we don't yet have a life theory in order to contain all of this work, because people are doing things individually, and that's good, but we have to have a collective sense of this grander vision. And that's one of the reasons why I put a lot of effort in this book in talking about how did we get to be where we are today. Mm-hmm. Is that all these incredible skills that we have developed, evolved over 100,000 years, right? There's skill sets that we still have with us today that developed over that long period, but we've learned not to value them. Like I talked about earlier, that we've learned to not value our oral history, right? But among the Yoruba, they talk about the Odu Ifa, and they have hundreds, thousands of stories for specific things. But other African people have similar ideas too, and they have their own stories that they tell to their own compatriots, right? But we're not learning from each other. We're not learning to see where is the congruence between the stories in Nigeria among the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Hausa, the Fulani, and the same stories that are taking place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right, among the Bantu, right? But when we start looking at those stories, they're saying the same thing, right? They're talking about the same ways of relating to the land, relating to the sky, relating to each other. But we have to find a way to bring those different stories into a collective whole. What are the fundamental things that each of them share? And so I talk about that. There's some fundamental ideas that all of those stories share. All of those relationships. African people, as a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Edwin Nichols, I think you may have had him on your show, talks about is the whole idea of an African value relationships, that our greatest wealth is in our relationships. in our relationships to each other, in our relationship to the water, to the land, to the sky. And we look across the continent, we see those same relationships expressed in local geographic terms, but it's the same thing. But we see differences because that's how we've been colonized and dehumanized and devaluing ourselves. But that happened then, right? We're not there anymore. We are recovering ourselves today, right here, right now. And so we have to continue doing that. And we are doing it. You're doing it, and others are doing it everywhere. And that's the beauty about it, that we're finding each other. Right? I thank my dear friend and colleague, Professor James Small, to help you find me, for example.
Shout out, a big shout out.
Right.
Yes.
So we're finding each other. We're no longer lost. We're no longer hopeless and helpless, right? We are doing something that's incredible that the world will benefit. Because when the world sees what we are, who we are, right? Well, then they say, hey, I can copy that. I can copy that. I can copy them, because they will see the value in that. And now many people are seeing the value in what we do. They're seeing value in our music, right? Because everyone is copying bits and pieces, sampling our music, right? You know, you go to a club in Berlin, you know, Black Coffee, right? You probably heard of Black Coffee. He's sampling, and he has what? Thousands of Europeans in his control, because he is controlling the rhythm to which they're dancing to, right? And so that's the power of our music. Just that, you know, our music has been corrupted, at least particularly in the United States, you know, stuff that we hear on the radios. But Fela talked about music is my weapon, right? It's the weapon of the heart, right? It's the weapon of the spirit, of the soul. And so when we hear our music, that brings us together, no matter where we're from. You know, someone in Soweto can hear some music in Nigeria, and they can relate to that because they will find the rhythms, right, that tunes them, that resonates with them. And so that's something that we can do, and we are doing that. We just don't have a grand vision of how to do that yet, but it's coming. And many people are working on that.
Thank you so very much. On behalf of all of us here, we are so happy and thankful to have you. And we want to reach out and give us a shout out to Professor James Small and Naisha, who actually put this wonderful platform together, and you to be here. I mean, you were just speaking, and I heard these words in my soul, amazing grace. So we can sing it again now, like we were once lost, but now we are all found, right? But in those days when we sang it in the sanctuaries, it was like entertainment, and we didn't even know what we were talking about. But like this decade is like exactly songs like that would have a different kind of a meaning and even a sense of direction. Like we were once totally really lost, but now we are found again, right? Connecting and uniting ourselves. So we thank you so much. The energy, the time that you put in, the lectures. I know I would stay in touch with you after the show, and yes, for all the connections. And then when you are coming back again, I would wish topic for us to explore. So it has been a pleasure to host you and to have you here. One last word for the evening, just a takeaway so we can relax and see ourselves again.
Well, the last word is reclaiming our narratives, rebooting our narratives, and generating new knowledge for our own liberation and validation of ourselves. And so thank you very much for hosting me. I trust that all the viewers found something valuable in our conversation and something that they can take away and use wherever they may be. And so thank you again.
Thank you so much. See yourselves very soon, sir. Yeah. And no, one more thing, please. I just want the audience to get this. You talked about when we shake our hands, that's one. And you talked about Seba. Can you just give a short word about it? I'm very sorry. It went off my mind.
Well, Seba is a Kemetic word that meant someone offering wise instruction and wise speech, right? And that's something that we need to engage in. It goes back to something from a number of Sebas in Kemet, from Ptah Hotep. You know, he talks about wise instructions for his children, for the community. And that's something that we have to engage in, not just idle speech, but wise speech, because speech is eternal. What we say doesn't just stay here in the present, but becomes part of the whole fabric of the universe. And so they understood that in not just in Kemet, but everywhere, because people valued speech. And so your word meant something. So Seba is something that captures that. And Sia, S-I-A, that's another Kemetic word, meant mind also. But the beautiful thing about Medu Neter, or the language, the Kemetic language, is that when you reverse that, you have the word for brain. Our African ancestors in Kemet were the first people anywhere in human history that actually had a word for brain, right? When I studied neuroscience, I don't have the book in front of me, by Candell and Swartz, on the cover was the Kemetic word for brain. Now, I studied neuroscience, right? And so they acknowledge where the science of studying the brain came from. It came from Kemet in the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. There's something called the Edwin C. Smith Papyrus, named after the person who found it. And it has actual neurosurgical procedures in the papyrus dated to around 1700 BCE, before the Christian era. So the Greeks did not invent medicine, right? There was no the Hippocratic Oath came from someone, the first professional physician, known as Imhotep, who was also an architect and designed what we know as the step pyramid today, outside of Cairo, Egypt. So the whole notion, that's what motivated me to study the brain. When I found out that Africans had the first word for brain, the flip of that was mind. There was no mind-brain duality like from Rene Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. No, Africans didn't have that. At least in Kemet, they didn't have that. And so we have to understand that we're building off of information that our ancestors have given us, and that's within us. We just have to bring it out and share it with others. So that's a long explanation about Seba, but the whole notion of raising your hands, right? There's a Neter in Kemet called Heka, right? And you see him with his hands raised up, and there's a twisted rope, kind of looks like DNA, right? Heka, right? Ka meaning the spirit. And so we see in rocks, painted on rocks in West Africa, in Chad and Libya, women dated to around 20,000 years ago with their hands raised, right? Because the beauty about it is that they were emitting energy. And so when we raise our hands, we're emitting energy. There's a practice in Japan called mahikari, based on what took place in Egypt. Oftentimes you see Egyptian netchers, we say gods, with their hands raised, right? Or their hands on the back of the king's head, for example, or their hands are embracing one another. That was an energy exchange, right? Something very basic. You know, some years ago, when I was in Germany, in Dusseldorf, I mentioned that at a summer school, I learned about the light that our bodies emit that can be measured, right? That you can count the photons coming from your brain, coming from your heart, coming from your hands, coming from plants. I was there. I did a summer school. It was a small group of people. It was an amazing experience to see how science is validating what African people knew thousands of years ago, that we are beings of energy. And we can talk about that on another show.
Yes, please. Wow.
That's what I'm talking about. See, when I'm talking about, this is not no mumbo jumbo, hocus pocus, woo woo kind of stuff, right? No. I want the listeners to get this. Don't take my word for it. Just use something called startpage.com, not Google, because when you use Google, they track you, right?
Oh.
So don't use Google for your search engine.
Okay.
Please, because they track you. Before you know, you start seeing advertisements pop up on your Facebook page, in your emails, but something called startpage.com. And just startpage.com. I think it's a Swedish company, Swedish search engine. I know it's a European search engine. And just put in the search bar biophotons, BIOPHOTON, biophoton, or the light within ourselves. And you'll be absolutely amazed to rediscover the truth that our people knew 30,000 years ago, that we're spiritual beings, that we're beings of energy. That's who and what we fundamentally are. And if we can get to that point, my dear sister, then we can have a commonality that transcends our ethnic locations, whether it's in the Caribbean, here in North and South America, or on the continent. And so I'll leave your audience with that. Don't take my word for it. You can check it out yourself.
Yes, I already put it in the chat box, the startpage.com. That was very interesting because we all know the experience that is telling us. So thank you so very much. It was just, giving back because you shared this experience with me, and I wanted also my audience and our people, our family to also be a piece of this, because we're sharing knowledge here that benefits all of us. And we're so grateful for one individual that we get, to follow us and to watch us. And so we give them all that possibility. So thank you again. Thank you again and again. I will wish you and your family. And I will be connecting with you after the show, please, for us to do your program when you come. All your colleagues, Professor James, Professor Nicholson, Dr. Norbert, all of them, they have a plan with us where they come once or twice in a month, or more once in a month. And so we want to get you also on that plan. Is it okay?
Thank you.
Is it okay?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. So
thank you.
Stay safe out there, and we see ourselves very shortly. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right.
Wow. Good. Another one big scholar, and another one big liberator, another one big freedom fighter, another one big scientist, another one big prophet, another one big, what else should I say? We are so thankful for the God that be and our ancestors and our race for giving us this opportunity at this time and place. And like I said, some songs that we used to sing, even when we used to go to church as children, like the Amazing Grace, we didn't even know why we were singing it. And when he talked about we were once lost, but now we're found, it just brought my heart to that. And I want to share that and send it back to you to like, this is really the amazing period for African people, as we were once lost, but now we are found again. Yes, as I said, we ought to have hosted a break-in tomorrow, but because of this issue of this 41 death of our African people crossing the Mediterranean today across Europe, children and babies among, is heartbreaking. We actually want to still reach out to get more information on what actually happened. But of course, I would take the 2 days off as usual to put a documentary and get some speakers, right, to give us statistics and concrete facts and evidence on this situation that has been somehow put under the carpet, but now we see it coming out again. How could it even happen that people still travel when we're talking about COVID? So COVID is not across the sea, or what is that? So COVID is only when we take flight that people will have to present, their COVID passports to travel. What about the Mediterranean? Did you even ever know that somebody is even traveling somewhere around the world at this point in time? Why Africans? Why do some people maliciously take advantage of the situation of our young ones on the continent, collect huge sums of monies from them? It doesn't matter whatever the situation is chasing them from the continent. But if you look at that boat, it was not even a boat, for God's sake. It's like a balloon, right, crossing the Mediterranean Sea into Europe in a balloon. You could see those images. They are devastating, my people. I mean, I can't even, nah. It's not something that we can talk about. It's not. Yes, we have to do that on Tuesday. Let's just calm down now. Any facts or whatever evidence that you have about or more information on this situation, please research it and bring it up and let us discuss about it. This is one of the issues. Why is it keep happening? Why does it keep occurring? Sorry for my French. Why does this keep repeating? Isn't it a signal for us, African people, that no matter what you think you are, we're still going to disgrace you. We're still going to show these images. We're still going to portray the kind of situation that is happening. Like they say, there's no smoke without fire. Now, if we didn't see the smoke, we wouldn't even know that there was a fire burning somewhere. Some of us share these things. We see them. We talk about, but there are millions even happening that we don't know. It is so sad. And once more, our condolences to those that have just gone down the sea and down the oceans. Imagine your ocean would be a place that you want to end. You don't want to imagine the situation they found themselves and those babies wailing for life and ending up down in the ocean. It is heartbreaking. When will we ever see something happen on our continent like that with other people that don't look like us? It just like we didn't even finish with the evacuations on us. It's always us. And that's why, they take advantage, and the stories like, the face of poverty, of sickness, of migration is Black. How can we disagree? I wish you all a happy weekend despite everything. Thank you so very much. Yes, that we could share. Remember what we're taking out today. Decolonizing, what does he say? Reclaiming our narratives. Reclaiming our narratives. And the second point I want to leave you with, remember, we are the first frequency people, the original beings that were created amongst other creatures. And remember, the whole of humanity comes from Africa. So we're the spiritual beings, we're connected. All we need to do is fudge more further. We are connected from a distance. Now we need to come even more closer so that we can share the light that he was saying, so that we can raise up those hands and connect to one another and send messages through our connectivity, through our spirit. We can speak love, peace, unity, healing to one another across even the oceans. So may their soul rest in perfect peace. And we see ourselves here on Tuesday. Stay safe out there. Much love, Ubuntu love to you and your families. And once more, thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
You are watching the Pan-African Daily TV with Dr. Susan Tata. The Africa we want: unity, consciousness, our culture, our spirituality, our history. One Africa for Africans worldwide. Motherland's calling its diaspora home.